We're going to start encouraging words in just a few minutes. And while people join us, Andy, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Andy and I were talking about our mothers-in-law. Is it mothers-in-law or mother-in-laws?
Mothers-in-law.
Uh-huh.
We were talking about our mothers-in-law. That's our encouraging word for the day.
And it would be an encouraging word, to tell you the truth, because we both love our mothers-in-law and
Absolutely
get along with them great, and they're very godly women with godly children and grandchildren, and I guess great grandchildren. Does yours have any greats yet?
I don't. Yeah. Let's see. Grandchildren? No, just great grandchildren.
Yeah. So we back during the height of the quarantine, mine, Carol Kay, was staying with us for a couple months, and as stressful as the quarantine stuff maybe was for us to kind of watch it going on out there in the world, it was great to have her here. I know you go out and visit yours from time to time.
Yeah, she's all the way out in Washington State, and we get out there once a year. They used to come our way at least once a year, and we'd go out there every other year when we had the kids and couldn't afford to fly. Now it's a 40-hour drive out there, just one way. And so we did that. We love those trips, but now flying is just so much faster and cheaper in the long run, especially when you got a long trip like that for two people. So
you're not paying for all those kids. So
right. So that's the way we go now. But we talk about driving it again, just for the fun of it. But
and then
anyway, but yeah, we love our Karen's father passed away a few years ago, but we loved having them here. They'd come and stay for weeks, and we'd go out there and spend 2.5 weeks with them, and it was a very good relationship. Quite a blessing.
Yeah. I miss Robin's dad too, Willis Kay. He's been gone for a long time. Must be getting close to 20 years now.
Oh, really?
It's really been a really long time, and it's just an amazing thing that we would that he gave me such an enormous, and Carol too gave me such an enormous blessing, and in the form of Robin and my whole family, and put her in my hands. It was kind of a big thing, and it's a kind of an amazing thing. And what's interesting is that our families, saw things and see things so much alike, and view our worldview and various different aspects, about the Bible, and just about living, and the kind of things that are expected of parents and grandparents. Everything is just, it fits together so well. And it's, of course, they taught us, and so I guess that's.
I mean, how can you not love and appreciate the ones who raised your spouse to love you and to love the Lord? And it's just really, I hear the stereotypical mother-in-law stories and stuff like that, and it just wasn't an experience for me or for Karen in our relationship. It was just a delightful thing.
Right. Yeah, all those mother-in-law jokes and things like that have never resonated with me. I've never really fully understood that. And that is really not our encouraging word. Those of you who just happen to be joining us now at 7 o'clock, a little bit after, we're sitting around talking about our mothers-in-law, and that's actually an encouraging word, we said, but we a lot of times talk about various different things while we're waiting for you to join us. And we do welcome you. Thank you very much for joining us. Andy, happy to have you back with us for our study.
Good to be back. Enjoy it always.
Yeah, it's good. We're looking forward to this one. We announced that we were going to study this topic tonight, but I'm going to begin with a quick reading from Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 17. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality nor takes a bribe. Our word for today is justice. And those of you who have watched for a while know, oh, wait a minute, they talked about justice last time. And so I think we told you at that time, the Lord willing, we would talk about justice again. And especially, we'd like to give you some more Old Testament scriptures that pertain to God, his justice, the law, and especially to application of it in daily life.
Yeah, last time we talked kind of about justice in theory and principle as a characteristic of God. But we, like you said, we wanted this time to talk a little bit more. Okay, what does that look like? What does justice look like from a biblical point of view? And so if we keep reading where you were at there, you read verse 17 of Deuteronomy 10. Just keep reading. It says, he, speaking of God, administers justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. Therefore, love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So you see an application being made. We're told about the character of God again, who he's concerned about. He is concerned about those who are the least capable of taking care of themselves, especially in their society. The widows and the orphans, the poor. And here he says that's what God does. He administers justice for them. Therefore, verse 19, you do the same. You do likewise. And I think that's really practical. Again, we can expand on that, but basically we're talking about, we are concerned about those who are powerless in our culture, maybe defend for themselves, given the current circumstances, economic or otherwise, spiritually. People take advantage of people. We were just talking about our mothers-in-law. And it's amazing to me the number of phone calls that they receive from predatory, that's what I call them, predatory people trying to swindle them out of their money with fast talking over the phone. And that's just unfair. That's unjust. And that's taking advantage of people in their old age. And that's God does not appreciate that. And then the other thing he says here is that you were strangers in Egypt. So you remember that. You're concerned about the strangers among you. We might call them immigrants. You want to make that applicable to our current situation. And so you were strangers, foreigners, aliens in Egypt, and you didn't like how you were treated. No, you don't treat people that way.
You were vulnerable.
Yeah.
You were vulnerable. Sometimes it takes us remembering times of vulnerability for ourselves to look out and find people who are vulnerable, not necessarily exactly the same way. He's not saying, remember, you were strangers, so make sure you're nice to strangers from Egypt. He's saying, remember your vulnerability, and then look out and find other people who are vulnerable as well, and do good toward them. This is a powerful verse when he says, the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords. The word God means mighty one. God is the mighty one of mighty ones, the powerful one of power, a powerful one of all power. He's the Lord, the ruler, the one with authority over all things. And what does he do with it? What does he do with all of that power and all of that might? Here's what he does. He shows justice, no partiality, and it doesn't matter who you are. You come to him, you are an orphan, you are a widow, you are an alien, a stranger, you are poor. And what does God do? God doesn't say, well, you don't look too worthy, you don't look like me, you aren't powerful, and so I only help the powerful. I'm a lord, I only help the lords. And that's super common today, where there's a kind of a good old boy club where the powerful people just sit around and help the powerful people. And I know we're going to criticize, the people who are the upper echelon, but that's us too. That's us too with our riches and with our friendships and with our circles of influence. What he's saying here is if God, the one who has all power, uses that power for the weak, for the alien, then what are you going to do with your power? You say, yeah, well, but I. He said, before you say I, remember you're vulnerable sometimes. Yeah. And what happened? The God of all power delivered you. So what are you going to do with your power to the stranger, to the vulnerable, to the widow, to the orphan? It's a great verse.
Yeah. And so, of course, we're familiar with the fact that Deuteronomy is something that Moses delivers. These are the words that Moses delivers just before they enter into the promised land. But if we back up in the Pentateuch, back to Exodus chapter 23, and look at some things, some really practical things. We want to kind of work our way through this first 9 verses. I'll just read it to start with, make a comment, and then David, you jump in wherever you want to. But Exodus 23, verse 1, you shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Also, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So you recognize that last rationale for why they should behave that way. But just look at that as you read through that. And if you didn't catch it this time, read it again when we're done here slowly and think about the applications that could be made to our current culture with these things. You shall not circulate a false report. Gossip, sometimes we would call that. But how often on the internet, on social media, do we find ourselves just forwarding right along some little click, some little snippet from YouTube or something that says what we like, concludes what we like, and we just pass it on without any consideration of whether, of the source, whether it's accurate or not. Well, that applies to that. That's unjust.
We don't think about that. I'm glad you said that's unjust, because it is. It's not fair for you to do that. I was looking at this word raise, and there's some different ways of translating. I'm glad you said the word circulate, because some definitions were publish or spread. Sometimes we only blame the one who invents the fake news or the false report. We blame them. We pass it on, and we just say, well, I don't know if this is true or not. And what he's saying here is that, nope, that's not the right thing to do. You do your best, and all of us may get stung sometimes.
Sure.
trying to follow up and make sure that something is true or not, and then it winds up being false. But we do our best, because this verse is saying it's unjust when you circulate a false report and all this stuff goes out. Maybe it's in keeping with my worldview or my politics, or even it supports something that is true, but it winds up being an actual proof that is false. I'm just telling you, that's going to turn around and bite you. Don't put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. This is not bearing false witness from the 10 Commandments. Again, justice depends on determining the truth, and sometimes if a witness is lying, then that's a violation of justice.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you shall not follow a crowd to do evil?
Mm.
How much of that's been going on lately? Again, whether it's at the protests or on social media, that here's the popular thing that's being said. And so we just jump on the bandwagon and we say it too, and we shout it just as loud. And we've got to be very careful about that because oftentimes the crowd, the majority, is wrong, is an error, and so that's unjust as well. And don't he says, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. So again, sometimes all people care about is this especially happens in politics. The bottom line, I get my guy elected. I get paid. Whatever the end justifies the means is what people oftentimes do, and that is unjust as well.
You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. Partiality meaning that in this case, where you put him down because he's poor, to make sure that you find a way to show support for your rich friends or the rich friends who will pay you or support you or something like that. And there's a cry in this nation that the poor are not being heard, and that that one person can do something and get away with it because they can, I don't know, pay for the high priced lawyers or bribe people, and then there are poor people who have some offense that's much less in consequence, and they wind up getting a much harsher sentence because they're a minority or because they're poor or because they're a foreigner, and that's unjust.
Yeah, and he's explicit about the point you're making in verse 6. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. So, and certainly, like we were talking about before, there are people who prey on other people because of their circumstances in life, and that should not be tolerated. I love verses 4 and 5. He talks about the donkeys, the ox and the donkey of your enemy, and you shall surely bring it back to him. You see it. Oh, well, I don't care about him. You know, that's his donkey. It's over there. Or in our day, maybe it's his car, and he's lost it, you know, or somebody's stolen it and you know where it is. Well, I'm not going to tell him because he's not my friend. That's not just. That's not how we should behave. And you see how that fits. Go ahead.
So that sounds a whole lot like love your enemies and bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, because the very next verse is, you know, and that the one who that hates you, his donkey is down and can't get up, and Jesus, I believe, was tapping into this, Matthew 5:44-45, saying justice has the same application now as it's always had. And we're to, because we're people of justice, because our God is a God of justice, and we love justice, then we're going to do the right thing.
Yeah. And again, he says, keep yourself, verse 7, far from a false matter. Don't kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. Again, you know, for a socially relevant cultural thing, the innocent, there's nobody more innocent than the unborn, and yet that's what we do for our convenience sake, our emotional state, whatever. We're thinking only of ourselves. And then the repeat there, you shall take no bribe. That was what we read in Deuteronomy. And you shall not oppress the stranger. Again, there are all kinds of applications that could be made to that, whether it's the person who's passing through town, doesn't know where he's going to take advantage of that person in their distress, or the person who is a worker who's come here and you know, there's all kinds of animosity that people have sometimes towards the immigrant in our culture. And we've got to be very careful that we're not just following the crowd. And I think that theme is running through this section here.
And I think that God's people, especially, I said last time that this is has an application to the vulnerable, but God's people today recognize that God has brought them out of Egypt, that brought them out of the slavery, and has delivered them. And so how can we when we see the spiritual deliverance that we have in Jesus Christ, how can we look down on other people who, who are lost, who are wandering, who have needs, and think of them in some way as less than human, or treat them in that way?
Right. Now, of course, we've looked at two passages from the law. These were the expectations that God had of the children of Israel. He's expressed his reasons why. That's because it's God's character, and because they were brought out of slavery, they were mistreated. They shouldn't mistreat other people. They should be really interested in justice. But of course, Israel did not live up to the law at all, and especially in this area. And we find, when we turn to, for example, the prophets in the Old Testament, what are they crying out against? There are two dominant cries against Israel, against other nations as well. And they both begin with I. Most of the time we'll know what one of them is. That's idolatry. And what is idolatry? It's the elevating of anything above God, whether that's your standard stone-carved, gold-laden image that you have in your backyard, or the love of money and things, as the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament. Or, as Israel struggled with nationalistic pride, Americans have that issue as well. So any of those things can become your idol, where you are dethroning God. But this is the thing I think is most important about that, is the other thing that the prophets cried out against, begins with an I, is injustice. Injustice, the opposite of justice. And what I think is important for us to see is that idolatry, the dethroning of God and putting something higher than God in our lives, inevitably leads to injustice. And so if we're concerned about injustice, we want justice, we've got to put God back on his throne. I mean, he's there. Acknowledge that he comes first in all things. And I don't think we'll solve our problems of injustice until we solve our idolatry issues. So let's just real quick look at one of the prophets. We looked at Micah last week. Most people are familiar with the one text we read from chapter 6 and verse 8. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's the text everybody seems to remember from the book of Micah. But in chapter 3, how are we doing on time, David?
Not good.
Huh?
Not good. So let me summarize chapter 3.
Okay, go for it.
So in chapter 3, Micah approaches the leaders of Israel, O heads of Jacob. Is it not for you to know justice? That's verse 1. And then he goes on to start describing how they're treating other people unjustly. They are stripping the skin from my people, the flesh from their bones. And he's basically saying, you are gobbling up my people by the horrible injustice and the terrible ways that they have been treating them. They cry to the Lord, but he will not hear him. He'll even hide their face from them, because they have been evil in their deeds. Then he goes on to say, your prophets, what do your prophets, the men who are supposed to stand up and say, justice is the way of the Lord, they're saying peace, while they're filling their stomachs with the food that they're being paid to do, paid to divine. He says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He said, I'm not going to give them any visions. I'm not going to give them any prophecies. It's just going to be dark. There's going to come a time where the prophets and the diviners are going to be ashamed. They're going to admit, verse 7, that there's no answer from God. What's going on? Where did God go? And the answer is that when we leave justice, God doesn't leave us. We've left God.
Yeah.
And so he says, verse 8, but truly I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and of justice and might, to declare Jacob his transgression, and to Israel his sin. And he is right that no true justice is going to come until we return to God, and until we apply the justice of God to life and to what we're doing. So
I love verse 9 there. Now hear this, you heads of the house of Jacob. This is a prophet, and rulers of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build up Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with iniquity. So this is what's going to happen. Verse 12, because of you, Zion's going to be plowed like a field. Jerusalem's going to become a heap of ruins. And the mountain of the temple like the bare hills of the forest. There's justice for you. God's going to bring about justice for your injustice. You're going to suffer.
Yeah. Very sobering for our country, sobering for us when we think about it. And ultimately, the answer is not simply in social reform and passing new constitutional laws or something like that. Ultimately, it is bringing God into the center of our lives. It shall come to pass, chapter 4 says, very next chapter, in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and he shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it. Many nations shall come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. This is looking forward to the time when the Lord's kingdom would come to this earth, and it would begin spreading here. And with it comes the true justice of God.
Yeah, we've been kind of focusing in on the injustices, and that's not very encouraging. But this is the encouraging hope that the prophets always were offering, even as they were condemning Israel. They were pointing forward to the Messiah and the time of the Messiah and the ideals of the Messiah. And we just got to remember that justice is a good word. It's a characteristic of God. Real quickly, one more text, if I can. Proverbs 26. Many seek the ruler's favor, but justice for man comes from the Lord. So we are oftentimes looking to our leaders, our civil authorities, for justice. And we hear the cries for justice all the time, but ultimately, where does it come from? Men are going to disappoint us. Governments disappoint us. We're seeing that left and right. But it ultimately comes from God. And that's encouraging because he is a God of justice, and he will take vengeance on those who do not put their trust in him, and he will vindicate those who do.
Thank you, Andy, for helping us focus on what I think is a super encouraging word and a super important and certainly relevant word right now with justice. I appreciate you being here with us.
My pleasure.
And all of you have an opportunity to do something about justice. You're going to look on TV and you're going to see something, you go, that's not going to do it. And you're going to hear something that's happening in the government, and you're going to say, I don't think that's going to do it. But you personally can show and speak and live the justice of the kingdom of God. And that can spread. And that can have its effect in the little circle, and then the circle that touches that circle, and then the circle that touches that circle. That is how the kingdom of God grows. And that's how God grows justice in our nation and in our world. That's what's so encouraging about justice, is that God not only executes judgment, but that he spreads it among his people. I hope you'll be encouraged to live that way.
Amen.